Thank you very much for the honour to speak on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CPC. I want to explain that that is not just polite words, it really is an honour. I'd like to start by the fact I don't know how many people here have actually been to the rooms in Shanghai where the CPC was founded. Well, I have actually. And it's really rather inspiring because you see how few people were there at the origins, only really a handful of people. Yet within 28 years, these people had led a party which had created a new state. And 70 years after that, China has been taken, as I will outline, from one of the poorest countries in the world to the brink of being a high-income economy by international standards. There is very few examples in history of how ideas of a small number of people could be translated in such a short period of time into such a huge organizational force with such consequences from the world. Okay, obviously people in China look at the question of the CPC fundamentally from a national viewpoint, and this is obviously correct, because the great pledge which the CPC made to China was that it would lead to the national rejuvenation of China. So I don't want to take away from that perspective at all, but I think it's also useful to make some international comparisons, because that gives you not merely an indication of what is the scale of the CPC's achievement, but I think it actually casts some indication on the national viewpoint itself. If we go back and see it, the way that I would see it is the following. In 1949, the CPC made a promise to the Chinese people. It said, if you adopt our program, our methods, and the path that we propose, the century of humiliation of China, which started with the invasions of the Opium Wars, will be brought to an end, and China will regain its place in the world, not as better than any other country, but with no other country being better than China. This I take to be the meaning of the famous words of Mao Zedong in 1949, the Chinese people have stood up. And these were symbolized, for, not to say when with the founding of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong did not say, now we will have extremely fast economic growth, or now we will take revenge for all the crimes which have been committed against China during the last 100 years. This phrase, the Chinese people have stood up, meant exactly what it said. It meant that after a century in which China was subject to endless humiliations and incredible attacks, I mean, we should never forget that in the period between the first Opium War and the founding of the People's Republic of China, almost 100 million people died in China as a result either of direct effects of foreign intervention or indirect effects, civil wars, famines, and other things. This was an extraordinary suffering, anyway, that can be described of the Chinese people. And what the CPC said is, if you adopt our methods and our program that we propose for the Chinese people, this period will be brought to an end, and China and the Chinese people will regain their position as respected a nation as any other in the world. The only decisive conclusion that can be drawn after 100 years is that the CPC delivered exactly that promise. Indeed, I would put it very simply that the social and economic achievements of China since the founding of the People's Republic of China, which are of course led by the CPC, are the largest of any country in the whole of human history, and have improved the position of the largest number of people and the largest proportion of humanity of any country in human history. Those are very serious statements, and then this type of thing is not to be made as a rhetoric. So I'm going to really try to prove this. Okay. Firstly, in the situation in 1949, foreign armies had trampled across China for a century. I did recently a program, one of these year review programs, and looking ahead, in which I said for young people in China sometimes don't realize how lucky they are, because foreign intervention and foreign threats for their grandparents, this was not a theory, was not a potential. For 100 years, foreign armies had trampled upon China, starting with the British, then with whole sorts of international international groupings, then with Japan, and this had been brought a stop to. Now, actually, I was very pleased to see that the young people of China did understand what an enormous achievement this was, because I said this had been brought to an end. And these words actually received more applause than anything else which I'd said, which I'd not quite expected. But they did understand what a gigantic achievement had been created by the CPC. Okay, so what I want to look at is look at some of the international comparisons that could be made on this. The first is China has achieved this economic and social step forward for by far the biggest proportion of humanity in human history. In 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. If you take the study by Angus Maddison, who's the world's leading expert on long-term economic growth and per capita GDP, he finds in 1949 there are only 10 countries in the world which were poorer in per capita GDP than China. If we go forward now 71 years, and then you look at it from the point of view of today, that is within a single lifetime, in just over 70 years, in a single lifetime, China has gone from almost the poorest country in the world to being, by international standards, on the brink of being a high-income economy. By China's domestic criteria, China has already achieved what it calls moderate prosperity. But it's probably simpler from the point of view of making international comparisons to take the World Bank's definition of a high-income economy. If you look at that, China will become a high-income economy by World Bank standards in either 2022 or 2023. But look at the scale of transformation that this means for humanity. At the present time, only 16% of the world's population lives in high-income economies. But China by itself is almost 18% of the world's population. So China becoming a high-income economy means that the number of people living in high-income economies in the world will more than double. And this is not just a question of abstract questions of per capita GDP. We know that the economic development, it determines life expectancy, it determines the availability of education, it determines the availability of health, the availability of culture, and numerous other criteria for human well-being. So China will, in only 70 years, have gone from almost the poorest country in the world to doubling the number of people who are living in high-income economies. There is no other country in history which has ever achieved this. I could make you a few international comparisons. The first country which ever underwent rapid economic development was my own country, Britain, with the Industrial Revolution. At that time, Britain was slightly over 2% of the world's population. If we go forward to the next very major country to experience rapid economic growth, it was the United States after its Civil War. The United States at that time was slightly more than 3% of the world's population. If we go forward to what up until now has been the fastest and biggest example of rapid economic development, it was actually the Soviet Union after 1929, which was about 8% of the world's population. But China, when it began to undergo rapid economic growth in 1978, was 22% of the world's population, almost 3 times as much of humanity as any other country which had ever undergone rapid economic growth. This is literally an achievement without parallel in human history. Okay. What does that mean also from the point of view of the Chinese people? Well, economists know that the best overall indicator of social and economic conditions is average life expectancy, because average life expectancy takes all the good things, that is getting rid of poverty, good consumption, good education, good healthcare, good environmental conditions. It takes away all the negative ones, subtracts from the number that all the negative ones, that is poverty, poor healthcare, poor environmental conditions, poor education, etc. And it gives you a single number, which is average life expectancy. Now, China, even before the 1978 economic reforms, underwent probably the greatest social miracle, except it wasn't a miracle, it was a policy, in human history. People sometimes want to present, why does Mao Zedong have such authority in China? Well, leave aside the question of national reunification and stopping national oppression. Average life expectancy in China increased by 31 years during the period between 1949 and 1976, the death of Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping, this is a gigantic human miracle, and you can understand if somebody leads you to live 31 years longer than at the beginning of the process, you're likely to feel really rather well disposed towards them. And I think, therefore, it's very important what Xi Jinping has said, that, of course, the two periods of China's economic development after 1949, which were taken from the first being from 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic, through to 1978 and the reform and opening up, and then from 1978 to present day, these are different from many points of view. They're different in method, they're different in policies. The CPC showed great adaptability, but both were gigantic periods of progress of the Chinese people. The first, as I said, was what I would describe as a social miracle. Average economic growth was satisfactory by most normal standards, but it was not super high. But the improvement in health, education, life expectancy of the Chinese people is the biggest of any major country in human history. And then, of course, in 1978, began what is the most rapid economic growth of any country in the whole of human history. From 1978 to the present day, the average growth of China has been 9.2%. No other country in human history has ever achieved such rapid economic development over such a long period of time. And this is not merely abstract, again, per capita GDP. It's not the, just concrete and steel. It's the fact that what this means is, for example, the average consumption of Chinese household consumption has increased by 1,800% since 1978. That is increased by 18 times. The next major country in the world after China is 900% in that period. That means that the average consumption, the average household daily meeting of needs of the Chinese average people has increased by 18 times in that period of time. If you look at poverty, China has very proudly, correctly announced in 2020 the elimination of absolute poverty in China. But again, I think it's useful to make an international comparison because the World Bank lays down an international standard for comparison of escape from absolute poverty. By that criteria, since 1978, China has lifted 853 million people out of poverty. That is 3 out of every 4 people in the world who were lifted from poverty. For every 4 people who were lifted from poverty in this period in the world, 3 of them were Chinese. This fact alone is enough to establish that China has made the greatest contribution to the development of human rights in the real meaning of that word of any country. And obviously, this was with the leadership of the CPC. Finally, some people tried to pretend, having all the data showing how incredible China's economic and social development is, they tried to invent things such, claim that social conditions are very bad. Well, we can judge this very simple again, because life expectancy is the most sensitive indicator of a country's overall social being. We know that per capita GDP is the single biggest contributor to this. Statistically, 73% of life expectancy is predicted by per capita GDP. But that still means that there are 27%, which is not accounted for by per capita GDP. And this is the effect of such things as the environmental situation, the health situation, the education situation, etc. So therefore, if you compare what you would expect a country's life expectancy to be, you'll find that for some countries it's lower than you would expect from per capita GDP. And in some countries it's higher than you would expect from per capita GDP. This is showing you that the overall social conditions are either better or worse than you would expect from the economy. For example, in the United States, you live 2 years less than you would expect from its per capita GDP. This is showing you the negative effect of various social conditions in the United States. In China, you live almost 3 years longer than you would expect from its level of per capita GDP. So again, this is showing you that the environmental conditions, the educational conditions, the social conditions are even better than the economic ones. Now, I don't mean by this, of course, just pretend there are no problems. China's achievements are so huge, there is no need to prettify them or exaggerate them or anything like that. They just have to be accurately stated. China still has to overcome certain of the problems which were created even by its very rapid economic development. If we go back 5 years, I know where I was living in Beijing that there were significant problems with air pollution, for example. These have got a lot better. China is now developing its own policies from the point of view of climate change. But nevertheless, what this data is showing you is that the environmental, educational, social conditions of the Chinese people are even better than what would be expected by the development of the economy. What led this? There's a simple explanation. It was, of course, the development of the CPC. All these statistical data are the way of showing that the CPC delivered the promise that it made to the Chinese people. That is, the Chinese people in 1949 decided to place their trust in the CPC and its methods and policies. And the CPC did not let the Chinese people down. It delivered what it was said it was going to do. And what did this produce? This produced the greatest improvement in the largest number of people and the greatest proportion of humanity in the whole of human history. That is what is the achievement of 100 years of the CPC. And that is why I'm both delighted and very honored to be asked to speak on this subject. Thank you very much for listening.